Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a powerful and emotional journey of love, healing, and transformation. This is a story about a mother's struggle to protect her daughter from the hidden pain she never saw coming. It's about confronting harsh truths, finding the courage to change, and building a new kind of family after betrayal and hardship. Join us as we explore the deep emotions that shape our lives and the profound lessons we learn along the way. Stay tuned. And don't forget to subscribe to start today's story. It was a quiet morning when I woke before the alarm, a habit that had settled into my bones after years of working as a nurse. My body, like clockwork, was conditioned to rise before the shrill of the alarm ever sounded. The first light of early summer seeped through the curtains, painting the room with a soft, golden glow. It was the kind of morning that promised peace, an hour before the world would ask anything of me. In the stillness of the moment, I could hear Sophie's steady breathing from the next room. My 8-year-old daughter, tucked in her bed, was still sleeping soundly. She didn't need to be up until 7, plenty of time for her to gather herself before the school bus arrived. I stood in the kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air as the coffee machine hummed its quiet tune. I had bought a blueberry bagel from Panera the night before, and it now sat on the counter, waiting for the toaster. As I worked, I couldn't help but think of how things had changed. The last couple of years had been difficult for us. Tom and I, Sophie's father, had separated. After a decade of marriage, the cracks had finally become too wide to ignore. The truth was, the last year of our marriage had been the hardest. Tom had risen through the ranks at his IT company, becoming an executive, while I had been left with the lion's share of the family responsibilities. He worked late into the night, on conference calls even during the holidays. His promises to Sophie, promises of father-daughter time, of weekends away, of family meals, were often broken. He became a stranger in our home, and I could feel Sophie's heart breaking every time he failed to show up. The divorce, when it came, was civil, almost too civil, as if we had both already mourned what we had lost. Custody arrangements were amicable. Sophie would live with me during the week, and Tom would have her 2 weekends a month. We agreed on shared responsibilities. And on paper, it seemed fair. But that was before Julia entered the picture. I stirred the strawberry jam into a small bowl, thinking of the past 6 months. Sophie had been spending her weekends with Tom and his new girlfriend, Julia. Julia was everything I wasn't: youthful, glamorous, always impeccably put together. And most of all, she had a thriving social media presence. She was an influencer with thousands of followers, posting perfect family moments, always smiling, always happy. Her posts often featured Sophie, tagged with phrases like, becoming the best stepmother, and family goals. At first, Sophie seemed to enjoy it. She got new clothes, went to expensive restaurants, and had her photos taken for Julia's social media accounts. But after a while, something shifted. Sophie's expressions when she came back from the weekend visits started to look different. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, and there was a weight in her that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mom." Sophie's voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned around to find her standing in the doorway. Her golden hair, usually so neat in its braid, was a little wild this morning, as if she had just woken up from a deep sleep. She rubbed her eyes and walked over to the table, still half dazed from sleep. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, my voice soft. "You're up early. What's going on?" "I wanted to draw," she said, her words still laced with the drowsiness of sleep. She picked up her sketchbook from the table, a habit she had developed over the past few months. Drawing had become her way of escaping, of finding peace in a world that often felt too chaotic. Just the week before, she had proudly shown me a drawing she had done in art class, one that her teacher had praised. It was a bright spot in her life, a small victory that she had clung to. I smiled at her, though my heart felt heavy. I had become so accustomed to the sound of her pencil scratching against paper that I often took it for granted. But today, as I watched her carefully sketching, a pang of worry settled in my chest. It had been 2 years since the divorce, and I thought we had adjusted, thought we were okay. But recently, Sophie had begun to withdraw. She wasn't as active at school. Her appetite had started to dwindle, and she seemed to tire more easily. I had noticed these things, but I had brushed them off as growing pains, as the natural consequence of our new life. After all, I was doing the best I could. Wasn't I? Sophie, I asked gently as I set the breakfast on the table. How's everything going? How's school? She glanced up at me for a moment, then quickly looked back down at her drawing, avoiding my gaze. It's fine, she said, her voice quiet, but I could hear the hesitation. The way she wasn't quite sure how to answer. It reminded me of the mornings when Tom used to promise to spend time with her, only to cancel at the last minute, leaving Sophie to deal with the disappointment alone. I had tried my best to make it up to her, but I was no Tom. We ate breakfast in silence, the only sound being the occasional clink of silverware against plates. As I watched Sophie, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but every time I asked her about it, she would smile and say, "I'm fine, Mom." She was so good at hiding her emotions, so good at pretending. I often wondered if she had learned it from me. The morning was unfolding as I had expected, slow, routine, comforting, but then, as I was clearing the table, I heard it, a soft sobbing sound, coming from Sophie's room. At first, I thought I might have imagined it, but the sound came again, louder this time, filled with a tremble that sent a ripple of concern through my chest. I rushed to her room, my heart racing with a mother's instinct. Unsure of what I might find, Sophie was sitting on her bed, her small frame curled up as if trying to make herself invisible. Her golden braids, usually so neat, were tangled messily around her head, and her eyes were squeezed shut, as if holding back tears. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked gently, sitting beside her and stroking her back. "My tooth hurts," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It really hurts, Mom." My heart clenched at the sight of her. Sophie had always been so strong, so independent, and now here she was, vulnerable, in pain, and too young to be bearing the weight of it alone. I ran my hand across her forehead and felt a slight fever. The concern grew in my chest, taking root. As a nurse, I was used to seeing all kinds of injuries, but seeing my daughter in pain always felt different. "How long has it been hurting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Since last night," she said, her voice trembling, but I thought I could bear it. I pressed my lips together. Sophie was tougher than most kids, and yet here she was, clearly suffering. I made a quick decision. "Let's skip school today. We're going to the dentist." Sophie didn't protest, which told me just how much the pain was bothering her. Her usual enthusiasm for school, for life, was gone. She nodded silently, and I could see her trying to hold herself together, like she didn't want to burden me. I could see her doing this more and more lately, trying to be brave even when it hurt. I was familiar with stress. In my work as a nurse, I'd seen people coping with stress in different ways, but the toll it took on children was always harder to witness. In my own life, the past few months had been filled with adjustments, Tom's new relationship, Sophie's changes in behavior, the tension I could feel in the air whenever we were together. I knew something was off, but I hadn't yet figured out what was happening to my daughter. I called Dr. Sarah Wong's office, a dentist I trusted for both her professionalism and her gentle approach with kids. Thankfully, they had an opening early that morning, and I quickly packed Sophie into the car, not wanting to waste a second more. By the time we arrived at Dr. Wong's clinic, it was just past 7 a.m., and the staff were already preparing for the day. The clinic was quiet, the air clean and sterile, the white walls almost calming in their simplicity. Sophie clutched my hand tightly as we walked in, her small fingers gripping mine like a lifeline. "Good morning, Sophie." Dr. Wong greeted us with a warm smile, bending down to Sophie's level as always. I appreciated her approach. She made the dentist's office feel less intimidating for children, like a safe space rather than a clinical one. Sophie managed a small smile in return, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Dr. Wong," I said, feeling a strange weight in my chest as I watched Sophie trying to keep her composure. I had been here before, watched Sophie laugh through dental checkups in the past, but today was different. There was a heaviness in the air that neither of us could shake. Dr. Wang carefully examined Sophie's teeth, guiding her into the chair and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. As she inspected the back of Sophie's mouth, I noticed the change in her expression. It was subtle, but I saw it. The professional cheerfulness in her demeanor shifted into something more serious. She was checking the same spot multiple times, her brow furrowing in concern. "Rachel, could you take a look at this?" Dr. Wang asked me, motioning for me to lean in. I stepped closer and peered into Sophie's mouth, my heart dropping when I saw it. Her back tooth was badly worn down. The surface, once smooth and whole, now had deep scratches, as if something had ground the enamel down intentionally. It was a shock. I had never seen anything like it before. "This wear is severe," Dr. Wang said, her voice soft but firm. "It's not normal for an 8-year-old to have this level of damage on their teeth. Do you know if Sophie has been grinding her teeth at night?" I blinked, confused. "Grinding?" I repeated. I hadn't noticed any grinding sounds at night. But as I looked at Sophie's face, something clicked in my mind. She had been so quiet lately, so withdrawn. Could it be that her stress was manifesting in this way? Could this be a sign of something deeper? Dr. Wang paused, letting the weight of the situation settle between us before speaking again. "It's not just grinding. There are signs of extreme stress here. Rachel, if you don't mind, I'd like to take some x-rays. We need to know the extent of the damage." I nodded, silently agreeing. I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of something much more troubling. As Dr. Wang prepared to take the x-rays, Sophie sat in the corner, absent-mindedly flipping through a picture book. I could see her trying to act normal, to distract herself from what was happening. But I knew her too well. The way she held the book in her hands with a certain rigidity, the way her eyes darted nervously, spoke volumes. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just her tooth. Once the x-rays were done, we returned to the examination room. Dr. Wang was still studying the monitor, her expression now unreadable. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. Sophie sat quietly beside me, her small body curled into mine for comfort, her eyes flicking nervously from the monitor to Dr. Wang. "Rachel," Dr. Wang said, breaking the silence, "I need to be completely honest with you. This isn't just a dental issue. There are deeper psychological factors at play here. These x-rays show signs of something called bruxism, nighttime teeth grinding that's often caused by intense stress. But there's something more concerning here." My stomach turned. I had heard of bruxism before, but I hadn't realized it could be so severe in a child. My mind raced with questions. But Dr. Wang's next words hit me harder than I expected. "I'm afraid these marks on Sophie's teeth aren't only from grinding. There are signs of forceful clenching. As if she's been under extreme emotional strain. Sophie's body is holding onto stress. And it's manifesting physically in her teeth." Dr. Wang paused and glanced at Sophie, who was still sitting quietly, staring at the floor. "I'm afraid I have to ask, has there been any significant change in Sophie's life recently? Something that might be causing her this much distress?" I hesitated, my mind running through the events of the past few months. My divorce, Sophie's visits to her father's new home, the woman he was living with, Caitlin. At first, I had convinced myself it was all fine. Sophie seemed to enjoy the weekends with her father. But looking at her now, sitting silently beside me, I wasn't so sure. There had been changes, subtle shifts in Sophie's demeanor, in her behavior. She'd stopped talking about her weekends, stopped bringing home the little trinkets and stories that used to fill our conversations. The smiles that once filled her face had become fewer, and lately, I'd noticed she wasn't eating as much, had lost weight, and seemed tired, even in the mornings, but I hadn't connected the dots. Dr. Wang's eyes softened as she watched me think. "Rachel, if you're comfortable, I'd like to talk to Sophie alone. Just for a few minutes. I believe she needs to speak about this. It's important." I nodded, my heart heavy with the unspoken truths I had been avoiding. Sophie's silence was not just about her tooth. There was something else, something I hadn't fully acknowledged. The pain in her eyes when she came back from her father's house. The quietness that seemed to envelope her when she spoke of Caitlin. Could it be that this woman, Caitlin, was somehow responsible for the changes in Sophie's behavior? I watched as Sophie stood up and followed Dr. Wang to a small corner of the room. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing fear. What would Sophie say? What had been happening when she was with her father and Caitlin? I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, but the knot in my stomach only grew tighter. A few minutes later, Dr. Wang returned. She didn't say anything right away but motioned for me to sit down. Sophie was standing by the window, her back to us, staring out into the parking lot. She didn't look at me as I sat down beside her. "I'll be honest with you, Rachel," Dr. Wang said quietly. "Sophie confided in me about something. She told me that over the past few months, she's been feeling like she's not enough. Not enough for her father. She's worried that if she doesn't behave perfectly, he'll be disappointed in her. And there's something else, about her time with Caitlin." My heart stopped for a moment. I looked at Sophie, trying to read her, trying to find some clue in her still face. Dr. Wang continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Sophie told me that Caitlin has been harsh with her. She's been told she needs to be perfect, always smiling, always obedient, and she's been told that if she's not good enough, she could lose her father's love." The words hit me like a wave. My mind reeled as the realization sank in. My daughter, my sweet, creative, loving little girl, had been living with the weight of emotional abuse. I had seen it, the change in her, but I hadn't understood what was happening until now. Caitlin's control over Sophie, the pressure she was placing on her to be something she wasn't, had been eroding Sophie's spirit bit by bit. I had no idea, I whispered, my voice cracking. Dr. Wang placed a comforting hand on mine. "I know this is hard to hear, Rachel, but now we know, and we can help Sophie. The first step is to get her the right support. We can work with a child psychologist who specializes in trauma. This is not something she should be facing alone." Sophie's small voice interrupted the silence. "Mom," she said, looking at me over her shoulder. Her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "Can we go home now?" I stood up, walking over to her and pulling her into my arms. "Of course, sweetheart, we'll go home, and we'll make things better." As we left Dr. Wang's office, I knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. But I also knew one thing for sure. Sophie would not face this alone. I would fight for her. I would protect her, and I would make sure she understood that she was enough, just as she was. As the weeks passed, Sophie's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. With the support of a child psychologist and a new routine that prioritized her emotional well-being, she began to smile again. Her appetite returned, and with it, her energy. The dark circles under her eyes gradually faded, and the weight she had lost started to come back. Most importantly, she started drawing again. Her sketches, once full of anxiety, were now full of joy, laughter, and hope. I, too, learned to heal. I realized that I had been carrying the weight of guilt for too long, guilt for not noticing sooner. Guilt for not protecting Sophie from the emotional harm she had endured. But through the process, I understood that healing is not about perfection. It's about growth, understanding, and the willingness to face the difficult truths. Sophie and I were rebuilding, one step at a time, creating a new kind of family that was rooted in love, respect, and empathy. David, too, started making changes. He began to prioritize Sophie over his career. His relationship with Caitlin ended, and he worked hard to prove that he could be the father Sophie needed. I didn't know if we would ever fully reconcile, but for Sophie's sake, we worked together to create a healthier, happier environment for her. The most beautiful part of this journey was realizing that family doesn't have to look like the picture-perfect image we so often see on social media. Sometimes, a family is simply about unconditional love, understanding, and the willingness to change. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt life stories.